This is going to be a 3-video mini course on server and client components and rendering in Next.js. The first video is going to cover what server and client rendering really is. The second video is going to be a deep dive into server components. And then you guessed it, the third video is going to be a deep dive into client components. And after watching this kind of mini course on server and client components and rendering, I'm highly confident you'll have a much better understanding of these concepts that can be a little bit tricky. We're going to go over some kind of gotchas to look out for as well. And it's overall going to really help your developer experience with working with Next.js and just make you a better overall developer. So without further ado, let's get into that first video. Rendering is a concept that gets thrown around quite a bit in web development in general, and then especially when you're talking about either Next.js or even talking about React.js. It's always kind of considering, okay, React.js is then going to render this to the page, or Next.js is going to render this server side. But what does like rendering even mean? What even do these different environments of rendering mean? Like rendering on the server versus rendering on the client. What does that have to do with a request response lifecycle and building hybrid applications? What does all this mean? Well, when I was starting out, I would have really appreciated a video that just kind of explained rendering and put some of these kind of concepts in the context of Next.js and React and kind of explain things a little bit more thoroughly so I could just have a better kind of mental model of things. So that's what I'm going to try to do for you here, kind of explain rendering, different environments, request response lifecycle, and all that stuff. So first off, what is rendering? Well, rendering is simply the process of turning your code into visible UI. So in React, you write your JSX, which gets converted into HTML, and that gets rendered to your web page, and it turns your code into visible UI or into the user interface that you see here. So for this page that I created, I wrote some code that eventually got turned into these drop-down boxes here, this text on the page, this like gradient here for this title. All of this was just code that was turned into UI. So code that was just rendered. And with Next.js, rendering can happen on the server, the client, or both, enabling what Next.js kind of refers to as hybrid web applications that balance performance and interactivity. So let's go over some kind of overall key concepts to consider when it comes to rendering and different environments in which stuff can be rendered. So basically, you have the client, which is the browser that renders the UI from the server's response. So when you hear client thrown around, it's basically whatever the user is interacting with. So it could be the browser, it could be a mobile phone. All these are kind of considered the client. And the client is going to render the UI based on what the server responds. So the server is just a backend machine that processes a request and returns data. Now, importantly, React, as well as Next.js, enables development across both environments using the same language. So in Next.js especially, you can use JavaScript both on the front end, the client, and on the back end, the server, to develop your application. To where in the past, it was very common to use maybe JavaScript for your client-side stuff, but then you'd use a different language on the back end. And I generally really like being able to use the same language both on the client and on the server. Now, this kind of leads us into the request response cycle. As I mentioned here, the browser renders the UI based on the server's response, and the server processes a request from your client and then returns data. So they're kind of like interconnected here, which brings us to this kind of life cycle of request response. So effectively, the user is going to trigger a request from the client. It might be going to a certain URL. It might be clicking a form or submitting a form. It might be, inputting something and then clicking a button. The user is going to trigger some sort of request. And then that client, which in web development is the browser, it's going to send an HTTP request to the server. The server is then going to accept that request, process it, and it might get more data from the database or a different API. It's just going to process that request from the client. And then once it processes it, it's going to return a response. and then the client is going to parse that response. That response might contain some data or some information from the database or different things like that that then allow the client to parse and render the UI based on that response. And then the whole process happens again when the user interacts with something else. So they do another URL change or they click another form or do something else like that. This whole process is triggered again to where your client and server kind of interact with each other to render your user interface and allow that interactivity that we've come to know in web applications. Now, importantly, there's this concept of a network boundary, which is like a conceptual line that separates the client and the server. In Next.js, you can use the directive use client or even use the directive use server to declare the kind of delineation between client and server, this network boundary. Now, in Next.js, your components by default are going to default to server-side components, but you can be more explicit about some different functions, like with server actions and stuff like that, to explicitly say this function is only going to run on the server. But then for other components that you want to be very interactive, you might declare that, okay, these are client components. They're going to be rendered on the client. Now, along those same lines, when it comes to the capabilities between client and server, they do differ, at least to some degree, to where the server, it tends to excel at tasks like accessing the database, authentication, authorization, different, more kind of computationally heavy stuff like that. The server is great at. But then the client is going to be much better when it comes to interactivity and handling user events and just the overall kind of user being able to interact with your web page. So the client and the server, they are kind of better at certain things. So you wouldn't necessarily want to use just the client for everything, and you wouldn't necessarily want to use just the server for everything. And luckily, in Next.js, you can kind of get the best of both worlds by building what they refer to as hybrid applications. So in Next.js, it can be helpful to think about your application code flowing in one direction, from the server to the client. Once the server sends the UI, the client takes over to manage interactions, which kind of hits on our previous note. The server and client, they kind of specialize in two different things, where the client's really good at interactivity, the server's really good at computation stuff, accessing the database, authentication, and sending data back to the client. And then once it does, the client takes over to manage those interactions. And when the client needs more data, it sends a new request to the server rather than reusing the original one. And this approach kind of makes it easier to decide where a component should render and where to draw the network boundary, that distinction between client and server components. This kind of tends to encourage a clean flow to where the server does the heavy lifting and then the client adds interactivity based on the responses from the server. So the TLDR here is that rendering is the process of turning your code into a visible user interface. It can happen on the server, the client, or in a hybrid setup to where you render some stuff on the server and some stuff on the client, as you see more and more in Next.js, where you can decide where your code runs using one consistent language across both server and client side. The request response lifecycle is a big part of this, where it starts when the user takes a certain action, and then that triggers a request to the server processes it, returns a response, and the client renders the UI, and then repeating this cycle as needed and as the client interacts. It's also important to define the network boundary between client and server to split logic intentionally and securely. So really kind of, having to think about, okay, do I want to render this on the server? Do I want to render it on the client? What do I want to ship to the client? And then Next.js ultimately recommends you to adopt a server-first mindset to where you render on the server when possible, and then add client interactivity as needed. So this kind of comes back to, practically speaking, in Next.js, you wouldn't want to make everything a use client component. You would just want to make client components for that specific stuff that needs to be interactive. So rather than making an entire page a client page, you would just create a client component that's maybe a button or an input, and then kind of slot that into the rest of your page that's rendered still on the server, and you kind of can get the best of both worlds with these hybrid applications. Everything you need to know about server components in Next.js. What are they? What are the benefits of server rendering in general? How are they kind of implemented in Next.js, and how are they even rendered? And then what is this thing that you might have heard before of the RSC payload? What even is that? Well, we're going to cover all that in today's video. So we'll start with what are server components. Well, they basically allow you to render UI on the server. In Next.js in particular, this rendering is optimized through route segment splitting and supports other strategies of rendering. But first off, optimizing through route splitting is basically sending a chunk of server rendered code to the browser for every route to improve performance a bit. And then for other strategies of rendering, you have static rendering, which is rendering at build time. So when you build your application, that is where that code is going to be rendered into UI on the server. Now you also have dynamic rendering, which is rendering at request time. So when the user goes to a certain URL and your browser makes a request to your server, that's then when your server is going to render your code into UI and then send that back to the browser. So it's doing it at request time instead of at build time. And then you also have streaming, and this is where work is split into chunks and streamed to the client as it becomes ready. So I have different videos on this, but you might create suspense boundaries around maybe more computationally expensive code. And what Next.js will do is it will progressively send that rendered code to the browser when it is complete. So if you have a page and then you have a computationally expensive like component within that page that you're rendering, well, you might wrap that component in a suspense boundary, send all of the other code to the browser first so the user can still see like, okay, this is the layout of the page and like other stuff can be interactive. But then for that computationally expensive component, Next.js will send that chunk, that rendered chunk of code to the browser once it's ready. So the user doesn't have to wait for the entire page to load. It first gets most of the page, and then you kind of send the chunks that you wrap in suspense boundaries as they are ready. And Next.js regards this as streaming. So it supports these three different types of rendering here. Now, what are the benefits of server rendering? Like, why should you care? Why shouldn't you just render everything client side and kind of do what a lot of people used to do when just creating more so vanilla React.js applications without using something like Next.js? Well, for one, it helps improve performance when it comes to data fetching because it moves data access closer to your backend, which can improve performance by reducing time it takes to fetch data and the number of requests the client needs to make. So literally just moving the data fetching or the data access to your backend can reduce the time it takes to fetch data in general. And then also it can reduce the number of requests the client needs to make. And some of the most time intensive things in an application are making network requests from the browser. So it can improve performance via data fetching. Also, I'm sure you know this one, security. It can help you prevent exposing different things to the client because you're just rendering on the server. You don't need to necessarily ship that to the client. Also, caching, you can share cached server rendered content across users. Performance, so, similar to the data fetching one and improving performance there. With server rendering, less JavaScript can be sent to the browser, resulting in the browser having less client-side JavaScript to download, parse, and execute. So if you're able to render something on the server and just send that rendered HTML back to the client, well, it's not like you're sending a bunch of JavaScript to the client to then have the client convert that into HTML and then render to the page. You just render it on the server, send that HTML to the client, so the client doesn't need to download, parse, and execute this JavaScript, which can slow down the performance of your application. And on a similar note, the initial page load can be better because you generate the HTML on the server, making the page immediately available to the client. And like I said earlier, the client doesn't then need to download and parse this data. SEO can also be improved because the immediate HTML helps bots index the page and generate other kind of social cards, which can improve your SEO as well as sharing. And then like I alluded to earlier with the streaming rendering that Next.js supports server side, you can split rendering work up into chunks and then send them to the client as they are ready. And this is kind of along the lines of partial rendering as well. Now in Next.js, by default, all of your components are going to be server components. So it's very easy to create server components, which is quite nice. And Next.js kind of has you thinking a little bit kind of server first when it comes to your rendering and components. Now you can opt in to client components, which help you add more interactivity. So server components have all these benefits, but client components still have the benefit of being very interactive, meaning the user can click on buttons and type in inputs and actually be more involved and interact with your application. For that type of work, client components are going to be the thing to use for that. And you can use those by adding the use client directive to the top of your client component file or your component file to make that be rendered on the client. We'll cover more about client components here in a future video, but by default, Next.js is going to have all of your components be server components. Now, how are server components rendered? Well, Next.js uses React APIs to render server components. It splits its work by route segment and suspense boundaries. So by default, it's going to render by route segment. And then if you put different suspense boundaries, like I discussed earlier, it's going to create separate chunks for that code that is wrapped in suspense boundaries, which is going to allow you to ship that potentially more computationally expensive code at a later time compared to some other code that may be more so just static content. Now, you can also think about this rendering when it comes to on the server and then what happens on the client. So on the server, React renders server components into a special format called React Server Component Payload, or also termed as RSC payload, which I'll cover in a little bit more detail here. But after it does this, Next.js takes this RSC payload and client component JavaScript instructions to generate the final HTML. And then on the client, the pre-rendered HTML is immediately shown as a non-interactive preview during initial load. Then after that, the RSC payload is used to reconcile the server and client component trees and update the DOM, the document object model, your tree-like data structure of all of your HTML on your web page. And then number 3, JavaScript instructions hydrate, which hydration means to display React components inside a browser DOM node whose HTML content was previously generated. So you generate the HTML and show that to the user, but then you take those JavaScript instructions to display React components inside those previously generated HTML nodes, and then it hydrates the client components, which enables interactivity. And then for this RSC payload here, just a little bit more details on this. It is a compact format React uses to deliver the rendered component tree. So it contains the rendered output of server components, placeholders, and script references for client components. And it also contains the props passed between server and client components. So if you hear RSC payload, they're talking about a compact format that React uses to effectively deliver your component tree to the browser. So to recap, server components allow you to render the UI on the server. So server side, you're going to take your code and convert it into your user interface, all the HTML that you're going to see, and then you're going to ship that to the browser. In Next.js, this is optimized through static, which is rendered at build time, dynamic, rendered at request time, and streaming. The work is split up into chunks and streamed to the client as it becomes ready. Now, the benefit of server rendering is that data access is moved closer to your backend, which can improve performance and reduce the number of requests that the client needs to make. It can help improve security by not exposing as much to the client. It can help improve caching and sharing server rendered content across users. Less JavaScript is sent to the browser, which is, as a good rule of thumb, the less JavaScript you send to the browser, the better your application is probably going to perform, because the browser will then not need to download, parse, and execute as much JavaScript. Initial page load is going to be better because the generated HTML on the server is going to immediately be available for the client. It doesn't need to download and parse that data. SEO can be improved by immediate HTML availability, helping bots index that a little bit better. And then you can also perform streaming and split that work up into chunks. Now in Next.js, server components are the default, so you don't need to do anything for creating server components in Next.js. All of your components are going to be server components by default, but to opt into interactivity, you can use the use client directive at the top of the page, which will make that now a client component. And then finally, server components are rendered by having React take those server components and render them into a special format called your RSC payload, which your RSC payload that is going to include your rendered server components, placeholders, and script references for client components, and then all the props passed between server and client components. And then once it has that RSC payload, it is going to take that and then it's effectively going to ship it to the browser. The pre-rendered HTML is immediately shown as a non-interactive preview. The RSC payload is used to reconcile the server and client component trees to update the document object model. And then JavaScript instructions will hydrate the client components, which will enable interactivity. So hopefully that clears up what server components are, how they're actually rendered, how they're used in Next.js. I know it can be a little bit tricky if you're, really used to thinking client side, but there are some clear benefits of using server components, and hopefully this video helped clear it up. Client components in Next.js. What are they? What are the benefits of them? How do they kind of work in Next.js, and what are some things to consider when using client components in Next.js? And then how are client components rendered? How does that work with server components? What is the RSC payload? We're going to cover all that here in today's video. So first off, what are client components? Well, they're just components in your Next.js application that allow you to write interactive UI. They're still pre-rendered on the server, but they can use JavaScript to run in the browser. So anytime that you want to write UI or have an experience that the user interacts with, so they take some actions on your web page, maybe it's opening and closing a little drop-down card like we have here, or maybe it's typing in an input, clicking a button. They're interacting with the page. The user is taking some action on your page. This is where you're going to be using client components. Now, importantly, they're still pre-rendered on the server, but they can use JavaScript to run in the browser. Now, this kind of point here for what are client components already kind of points out one of the main benefits of client components of creating your interactive UI. But to kind of touch on that a little bit more here, anytime you want to use state or the use effect hook or really any other hooks in your application or event handlers, this is where you're going to be using client components. It's going to allow you to give immediate feedback to the user and update the UI. So anytime you're using React State, hooks, effects, event handlers, you're going to do that within a client component. Additionally, client components also give you access to browser APIs. So if you want to use local storage, the geolocation API, there's a ton of different browser APIs, but anytime you want to kind of reach for one of those browser APIs, it's going to have to be done within a client component as well. So client components allow you to access React State, hooks, effects, event handlers, browser APIs, and really any time you want to add that interactivity to your page and immediately update the UI based on some sort of user action. So they click a button and that pops up a modal, and then they type in the input of the modal, and then they save and you want to show a toast message or something. All this is probably going to be done, or a lot of it's going to be done with client components. Now in Next.js, there's a few considerations here. So by default, Next.js components are going to be server components. So you need to opt into creating client components. And you do that by at the top of your file. So you write your component in React.js, just like any other component, you export a function from a file. Well, at the top of that file, to make it a client component or to gain access to some of those browser features or React State and all that stuff, you're going to put the use client directive at the top of the file. So just a string that says use client at the very top of your file above your component. And this use client directive is used to declare a boundary between server and client modules. All modules imported to a use client file, including child components, are considered part of the client bundle. which is a very important consideration. Anytime you import a component into a use client component, that is going to be a client component and included in the client bundle. So an important thing to keep in mind is that this use client directive, it declares a boundary between server and client modules. It's not necessarily just saying like this single component is going to be a client component and this single file is going to be a client component. It's saying our client bundle starts here with use client, and anything you import into it is going to be included in the use client bundle, which is also a reason that Next.js generally recommends you to try to keep your client components as more so leaves in your React tree. So you keep them far down your React tree, meaning you don't import a lot of different components into those because you don't want to kind of blow up that client bundle and lead to just, large client bundles that can potentially decrease performance, and it kind of prevents all the benefits of server side rendering. Now, trying to use event handlers, React hooks, and browser APIs in server components are going to cause errors in your application. So it's not like it's something that just is recommended by Next.js. If you try to do it, your application will literally error out. So keep in mind, anytime you try to do this stuff, you have to be paying attention to where you're setting up your server and client boundaries and whether you're actually in kind of your client boundary when using these features. Now you can define multiple use clients in your React component tree. So it's not like you only have to define one boundary. Like say you have a far left branch of your tree, and at the bottom of that branch, you have a client boundary. And then down the right branch of your component tree, you do it again. And then down like another branch of your tree, you do it again. That's totally fine. You can do that in multiple areas. And this splits your application into multiple client bundles. Use client doesn't need to be defined in every component that needs to be rendered on the client. Once you define the boundary, all child components and modules imported into it are considered part of the client bundle. So that kind of goes along with what we said earlier. Once you mark a file, use client, all child components and modules imported into it will be a part of that client bundle. So that also means that you don't necessarily need to, if you import another component into a client component, you don't necessarily then need to put use client at the top of that file, because you've already marked that boundary as part of your client bundle. Now, you could argue that just to be explicit about it, putting use client in that, like saying, hey, this is a client component, putting use client at the top still makes sense, which I would actually agree with as well, but you wouldn't necessarily need to. So just be careful. If you don't want something client side, but then you import it into a client component, just know that that is now going to be included in the client bundle. Now, how does all this actually get rendered? It's kind of different depending on whether it's a full page load or it's on subsequent navigations. So for a full page load, React renders the server components into the RSC payload, the React server component payload. Next.js takes the RSC payload and client component JavaScript instructions to generate the final HTML. The pre-rendered HTML is immediately shown as a non-interactive preview during the initial load. The RSC payload is used to reconcile the server and client component trees and update the DOM, or the document object model. This is the tree-like data structure of all of your HTML nodes throughout your actual web page. And then JavaScript instructions will hydrate client components, enabling interactivity. And hydration is effectively displaying React components inside browser DOM nodes where the HTML is already generated. So that's for a full page load. But then on subsequent navigations, client components are rendered entirely on the client without the server rendered HTML. The client component JavaScript bundle is downloaded and parsed. Once ready, React will use the RSC payload to reconcile client and server component trees and update the DOM. All right, so there is a little distinction here between full page load and subsequent navigations. So just a quick recap here of the main points. Client components, they are components that allow you to run JavaScript in the browser and allow you to add interactivity to your apps. The main benefits are interactivity, using React features like state, effects, hooks, And then you also can use event handlers, browser APIs, local storage, session storage, all that stuff. And then in Next.js, your components by default are going to be server components. But then to make that a client component, you add use client to the top of the file. Now, importantly, all child components and modules imported into a use client file are going to be part of the client bundle. So use client directive at the top of the file isn't just saying that this file is going to be a client component. It is saying, hey, this is the start of our client bundle. Everything that's a child component or imported into this is now going to be part of that client bundle. So it marks a boundary. It's not necessarily just saying this file. And then for their actual rendering, React will create this RSC payload based on your server components. Next.js will then take this payload and the client component JavaScript to generate the final HTML. This HTML is pre-rendered and shown as a non-interactive preview during the initial load. RSC payload is used to reconcile server and client components and update the DOM. JavaScript instructions then hydrate the client components, enabling interactivity. For subsequent navigations, client components are rendered entirely on the client without the server rendered HTML. And then the client component JavaScript bundle is downloaded and parsed. Once ready, React will use the RSC payload to reconcile client and server components and update the DOM as well. So that is client components here in Next.js. For me, the two main takeaways are that the use client directive more so sets a boundary to where all child components modules imported into it will still be a part of the client bundle. And then also client components are just components that you use for interactivity in your application. So hopefully this video makes what client components are clear, and it kind of gives you a better idea of how they work and how they kind of set a boundary in your application and what you use them for and how they're actually rendered in Next.js.